When people talk about the Panther tank, opinions range from it being the best tank of World War II all the way to being little more than useless, even doing more harm than good to the Germans. However, whichever is true, and you'll come to your own conclusion by the end of this video, one thing is certain, and that's that its crews would suffer quite a bit, despite having the quote-unquote privilege to ride in the most advanced tank at the time. They are also the biggest cause of destruction of Panthers, and we're going to show you why. So if you really like the Panther tank from movies and video games, prepare yourself to be disappointed a bit. Now, when we take a look at the Panther's frontal armor, powerful engine, and of course the penetration power of its long 75mm tank killer gun, we could assume it was high on the list of best World War II tanks, especially when compared to other medium tanks. However, this wouldn't be the case. The Panther was designed as a medium tank, although the similarly weighted Soviet IS-2 was called by the Germans a super heavy tank. It's said that the Panther came as a frantic response to the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, which startled the Germans and outclassed their Panzer IIs, IIIs, and early IVs with short-barreled guns, at least for a brief moment. But the Panther's development started much earlier, even before the Tiger I, and these issues with Soviet armor only hurried its appearance on the battlefield. And that meant it got into production straight from the drawing board in record time, sacrificing much-needed testing that other tanks received. Hitler wanted the Panther to be ready for battle at Kursk at any cost, and surely the cost the Germans would pay for this rushed and incomplete development. The important thing was that the Panther was being built on a completely new technology. Tiger I, for example, saw combat before the Panther, although it started after it, because it was being built on the already familiar Panzer IV concept. The Panther, on the other hand, was supposed to be not a heavy breakthrough tank like the Tiger, but a new, highly mobile medium tank, in theory to replace Panzer IVs that began showing their age. The Germans didn't know it at the time, but they were making a crucial mistake with this thinking, which maybe even cost them the outcome of the war. For 5 Panthers, they could build 6 improved Panzer IVs and would have 1,000 tanks more, which actually worked. But it's easy to be a general after the battle. So, through rushed and incomplete testing, the Panther was loaded onto trains and sent to the east. Its combat debut would begin during Operation Citadel, which developed into the Battle of Kursk, one of the largest tank battles in human history. But before even going into combat, Panthers sustained losses, and not from the enemy, but from themselves. 2 Panthers caught fire from their engines as they were unloaded from the train and burned completely. Several more had the same thing happen to them just on their way from the railway to the front lines. This would be the first big flaw in the Panther that could have been realized much earlier if it had more time for testing. It would take out a lot of Panthers, some of them destroyed completely. The problem was that the fuel mixture wouldn't completely combust, so live fuel would end up in the exhaust system, which was already hot. Then it could either explode or start spitting out flames around electrical wiring, and if you didn't notice that in time and put out the fire, it would start spreading and the whole tank would catch fire, which is not something you'd want in a small, closed space where there are 5 people, fuel, and ammunition. Besides fire, early versions had problems with those flames at night because they were shooting out of the exhaust and were visible from miles away, revealing your position. Panther had a great Maybach petrol engine that worked quite well in other heavy German tanks, but in the Panther it was tuned to 700 horsepower and paired with a horrible cooling system, so it wasn't hard to overheat it at higher RPMs. To make everything even worse, crews operating the delicate and fragile new technology were hastily undertrained, with most of their training completed on Panzer IVs. Only a few of them had actual combat experience, with just a few live fire exercises before being sent to fight in one of the heaviest battles ever. At the time, the Panther was a secretive new tank, so photographing or making written notes about the tank was strictly forbidden, and crews had to memorize everything. The better way to put it is that they just got familiar with the Panther before combat, rather than actually being trained. Now the operation began, and on their first day of combat, new Panthers were driving towards Soviet positions. They were first stopped by wide and deep anti-tank ditches filled with water, and while more experienced crews turned around and tried to find another way, the less experienced ones tried to drive across due to misunderstandings in communication. Surprisingly, they immediately got stuck and then realized they had driven into a minefield, disabling 2 entire companies of Panthers before the actual fighting even began. But this was all part of the Soviet plan. Their artillery now rained down on immobilized Panthers while crews abandoned them and ran to their lines. Panthers that didn't get stuck would a little later see their first tank-on-tank engagement, and a bit ironically, it wasn't any tank they expected to see, but American M3 Lees supplied to the Soviets through the Lend-Lease program. M3s, of course, were no match for the Panther, and 6 of them were quickly knocked out while the others were forced to retreat. But already on their first day in combat, 18 Panthers were lost. The next day, 37 more were knocked out, one of which was destroyed together with its whole crew by a Panzer IV in a friendly fire incident. Throughout the Battle of Kursk, more than 200 Panthers were knocked out, but the disturbing thing is that 130 of them were put out of action just due to their mechanical breakdowns. So, what actually went wrong? The first thing in early Panthers that horrified its crews was the fact that their revolutionary armor could be penetrated from the sides by Soviet anti-tank rifles, and those 14.5mm rifles were in great supply and easy to aim and use. There was a weak spot right here between the upper hull and the wheels, which wasn't sloped and was much thinner than the frontal plate. Hitler personally ordered to increase the thickness of frontal armor at the cost of the sides and rear, and although this should be a logical solution, as most of the threats came from the front, this made the tank, besides being alarmingly easy to kill its crew, also unbalanced and front-heavy, which then caused other problems. The anti-tank rifle issue was solved by adding side skirts to cover that vulnerable gap, but Panther crews couldn't do anything about the other issues with their tank. When we say that the Panther was a notoriously unreliable tank, perhaps that's an understatement. Just take a look at this. The Panther's final drive, which is the part that transfers engine power to the drive wheels, was designed for and tested on vehicles under 30 tons. Panther weighed over 50 when combat ready. Additionally, it was made from cheaper and softer materials, and combined with a poorly trained driver, it had a lifespan of only about 100 miles before giving up and breaking. To get a better picture of how horrible this was, Panther had a fuel range of around 180 miles. So your final drive would break each time before you went through one tank of fuel, and when it failed, the tank couldn't move, while replacing it in the field was a nightmare. That's assuming you even had a spare one to replace it with, as Germany soon went into shortages of everything. Experienced drivers could be ultra careful and make it last a bit longer, but in battle, where you have to shoot and move in order to survive, you couldn't exactly be very careful with your clutch. 60% of all Panthers that got immobilized, mostly due to this issue, had to be abandoned, blown up, or burned by their own crews. They simply couldn't recover it in time, and it was better to destroy it than to give it to the enemy. Those that could be recovered had to be repaired, and it wasn't rare for them to break down again just while returning from the field workshop to the front lines. Panther's overlapping road wheels, the same system used in Tiger 1 and 2 for example, had their own ways to make the crew suffer more than they already needed to, especially on the eastern front where Panther saw most of its action. Mud and debris would lodge between the wheels, and if not cleaned before parking, it would freeze, and now you had an immobilized tank. Before going to sleep, this was usually the job of the greenest member of the crew to clean the tracks and then park on branches to lift the tank from the ground. With all factors combined, Panther's combat availability was just catastrophic. Only half of them would be operational at any given time, even in normal conditions. All of this was then made worse later when Germany started running out of fuel, but there were some improvements to those early flaws, although the elementary core problems couldn't be resolved. Despite all this, the Panther could be very effective in combat when used by well-organized crews. Its 75mm gun was over 5 meters long and had good armor-piercing rounds with extreme muzzle velocity. It was actually considered the best tank killer gun the Germans had. It could fire 6 rounds per minute and had more than enough penetration capability to destroy any Allied tank at ranges over a mile. In some Panther variants, the problem with the ammunition was that around 50 shells were stored in a single spot in the side sponson, so one hit at this spot would send the tank and its crew to eternity. On the open fields of the Eastern Front, Panthers proved they could cause horrific losses to Soviet armor when used effectively and when they actually worked better than a bunker. Speaking of that, a lot of Panther turrets and guns were actually used as bunkers in those famous box concrete fortifications the Germans made on their fixed defensive lines, like the Siegfried and Atlantic Wall. Panther's turret was up-armored to sustain heavy shelling, and underneath was a fighting compartment in the ground, with enough ammo to cause the Allies a lot of trouble trying to break through them. They were actually quite effective and extremely difficult to destroy. As the Allies landed in Normandy, some 400 Panthers were transferred there and would fight in heavy tank-on-tank engagements, but now in terrain they were never designed for. Normandy's terrain took away Panther crews' advantage to use their long gun, and narrow streets and soft ground also didn't suit them. They caused serious losses of Shermans and Churchills, but were a lot of times outflanked by Allied tanks that could go where the Panther couldn't. The Sherman Firefly could now destroy the Panther head-on, so most of the engagements came down to who fired first. If you think that life for the Panther crew couldn't get any worse from the fact that by the later stage of the war they were fighting on just a couple shells for their gun and driving on fumes, there was one action that would outmatch all of that. During the Battle of the Bulge, 5 Panthers were creatively disguised as American M10 tank destroyers. They added some plates to mimic the frame of a Wolverine and painted on them US camo and markings. The idea was to drive unopposed into the rear and cause chaos and disruption among American lines. However, as brave and daring as it sounds, unfortunately for the Germans, someone became suspicious of these weird-looking M10s, and all 5 of them were quickly destroyed. So, as you can see, life for a Panther crew member was anything but easy, and they definitely had their fair share of suffering inside that tank. But what do you think about the Panther? Was it really worth all the trouble, or should the Germans have just stuck with the more reliable Panzer IVs?